Good morning. So, is this volume up enough, Andy? Is this? I don't know. So, for the next few weeks, I want to teach. I've taught before overviews of the Gospels, but I want to concentrate what's unique about Matthew, what's unique about Mark, what's unique about Luke, to give us a better feel for the nature of these Gospels and why they were written. What audience did the Gospel author have in mind, and so on. And then after that, I think that Andy has a good topic. He's going to teach us for a week or two at the end of the month. And then I'll do a couple more weeks on Mark and Luke. And then Jay will be teaching the last couple of weeks of August. Okay, and then in the fall, I plan on teaching the class in the fall about worship. Everything to do with worship, from the biblical passages on worship to making us think about the spirit of worship. And why do we sing a cappella? We haven't gone over that recently, so things like that. So that will be in the fall. So the goal is to get insight into the so-called synoptic gospels. Synoptic means parallel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are pretty parallel to each other, and John is pretty different. Right? And we'll get insight by studying their differences. One of the first things we want to look at is what stories are unique to the Gospel of Matthew? What stories are unique to the Gospel of Mark? What stories are unique to the Gospel of Luke? That tells you something about those Gospels. But also, when they tell the same story, they don't tell it in the same way. They emphasize different details. In the case of eyewitnesses like Matthew, they remember and emphasize different details. What does that tell us about what that gospel author is intending? How do these different kinds of uniqueness tell us about the goals of the gospel author? Now, Matthew is often called the Jewish gospel for various reasons. The unique features of Matthew that we're going to see point towards, among other things, but primarily, he was trying to persuade Jews around 60 AD or so that Jesus Christ was the Messiah promised in the Old Testament and that they should be part of this new covenant. And, for example, we start right off. What's the first thing we see in Matthew? There's a genealogy of Jesus followed by a birth story of Jesus. Now, those are important to show that Jesus was not only divinely born, but that he was of the lineage of David. And secondarily, Matthew has a theme that Christ is the new Abraham, the new bearer of a covenant, so he's descended from Abraham. But it was important to show that he was descended from David, because all of those messianic prophecies in the Old Testament kept coming around to the idea that this is a son of David. This is a descendant of David. The Messiah has to be descended from David. And so that was important for Matthew to convince his audience. It's kind of unfortunate that our New Testament starts out with something that when you're young and don't know what's going on, doesn't mean a lot to you. You're not Jewish. You're not steeped in messianic prophecy. You're a young child and you open up and what's the first thing you see in the New Testament? So-and-so begat so-and-so. And it's like, what is this about? Well, it's actually quite important for Matthew's purposes. If we want to show that God prophesied the Messiah and that this is the Messiah who was prophesied, then it turns out to be important. And we're going to see that Matthew focuses very much on the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Now, just jumping ahead a little bit, that's a very stark contrast with the Gospel of Mark. We believe that the Gospel of Mark is Mark recording the teachings of Peter in Rome. Rome was a place of Gentiles. Peter was teaching Gentiles. Gentiles didn't know anything about the Old Testament. They weren't waiting for a Messiah. They didn't know anything about messianic prophecy. So Mark starts right out, no genealogy, no birth story, starts right out with John the Baptist, a brief mention of his ministry, and then we're right into Jesus' ministry. Mark quotes a prophecy that John the Baptist would come prepare the way for the Messiah. And after that, I don't believe there's another direct quotation of Old Testament prophecy in the whole book of Mark. Whereas Matthew is over it and over it all the time. Old Testament prophecy is one of his themes because he's not writing primarily to Gentiles. He's writing primarily to Jews to convince them Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. So we see his use of the Old Testament, primarily messianic prophecy quotations, but also not just direct quotations. There are some allusions where it doesn't say the prophet Isaiah said this or whatever, but there's some language that comes from the Old Testament. And then there's typology, where you're not quoting a prophecy. Instead, you're just saying, look at the way that God operates in the history of the Old Testament. He's operating the same way now with Jesus and the New Covenant, but the original passage wasn't a prophecy. It's a pattern. It's a pattern of the way God works, not the same as a futuristic prophecy. So we'll take a look at one example in Matthew chapter 2. Verses 14 and 15, after an angel appears to Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, in a dream and warns him to go to Egypt. Verses 14 and 15 say, so he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and escaped to Egypt. He stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, he's quoting from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Now, Hosea in chapter 11, verse 1 wasn't making a futuristic prophecy. This was a statement about the patterns, the way in which God operates in Old Testament times. And Matthew is noticing the similarity, the centrality of the Exodus we've talked about before. The Exodus from Egypt was one of the main things in all of Israelite history. That's why the Passover was the primary festival that they celebrated, and God continually referred to himself through the prophets in the Old Testament as, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. And that was one of the central things that they were supposed to remember. And we saw on Wednesday night, recently I taught about the theme in Isaiah. Isaiah, looking at the captivity in Babylon and prophesying that someday they would be brought back from Babylon to the promised land, saw a pattern. You go in captivity to Egypt. Then you're brought out of Egypt to the promised land. Centuries later, you're taken off in captivity to Babylon, and then you're brought out of Babylon back to the promised land. And so Isaiah used Exodus language to describe coming back from Babylon, because Jews believed that this was not a coincidence. They didn't believe in coincidences. They believed that God had a pattern for how he operated with his people. And so there's a difference between making a futuristic prophecy and Matthew saying, look, the prophecy got fulfilled, and saying, look, the pattern is continuing. We went into bondage in Egypt. We came out of there to the promised land. We went into bondage in Babylon. We came out of there to the promised land. Now the Messiah has come, and he flees to Egypt. And then he's brought, when it's safe, he's brought back to the promised land. And so that's all that Matthew is saying here. It's typology. It's a pattern rather than truly futuristic prophecy. An example of allusion where you don't have a direct quotation would be in Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, go and rebuke him in private. Now, he doesn't say, I'm quoting Scripture, and he's not directly quoting Scripture word for word, but his Jewish audience would recognize that there's language here from a very important passage. The verse before the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule first appeared in Leviticus 19, verse 18. And this is a passage about forgiving and about treating your neighbor as yourself. In verse 19, chapter 19, verse 17, we will see language that is very close to the language that Jesus just used, but it's not a quotation that Jesus is making. You must not hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor directly, and you will not incur guilt because of him. Don't harbor hatred toward your brother. Just go to him in private and rebuke him, and then it'll be over. Now compare that to the language of Jesus in Matthew 18, verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and rebuke him in private. And then he goes on to say, if he listens to you, you've won your brother back. Otherwise, take 2 witnesses with you, and so on. It's a familiar passage to us in the church. But this is an example of what we mean by allusion. Not direct quotation, but it would ring a bell. In a Jewish audience who really knows their Old Testament, they would say, I recognize that language. I recognize that idea. And this is all over Matthew. This happens as many times in Matthew as the direct quotations from the Old Testament happen. So this is one thing I think that because, naturally we read the New Testament a lot more than we read the Old Testament, right? It's of greater interest to us as Christians. But I think we often miss something that the original Jewish audience didn't miss. They were so steeped in the Old Testament that when you started using Old Testament language, they said, I know what he's talking about. I know what he's referring to. And it doesn't, it kind of goes right over our heads sometimes because, these were people who were memorizing all the important passages word for word in Hebrew and so on. So when you used Old Testament language in front of a Jewish audience in the first century, they knew exactly what you were talking about. And quite often, we're reading, and maybe in your study Bible there's a little cross-reference over in the margin that says Leviticus 19:17, and we don't usually take the time to go off and, well, why is that cross-reference there, and so on. But in order to fully get the flavor of what Jesus was doing with his Jewish audience that he was speaking to, we would probably have to know our Old Testament a little bit better. But Matthew, as a Jew, recognized it. He remembered a lot of these occasions where Jesus spoke like this, and he recorded them in his gospel, and that passage isn't in any other gospel. Matthew remembers these Old Testament references more than any other, more than Mark recording the preaching of Peter to the Gentiles, more than Luke, who was not there as a witness, who's interviewing people, and who was a Gentile himself, right? So you get this Jewish gospel, this very Jewish-flavored gospel of Matthew as a result. But messianic references are really the bulk of the direct references to the Old Testament. And you see it in the titles that Matthew uses. He uses this title, Son of David. He starts right out in verse 1 before he does the genealogy. The genealogy of Jesus, son of David, son of Abraham. Now, we read all the Gospels, and sometimes we don't catch the differences between the Gospels. We think, of course, he's called the son of David, but he's only called the son of David very few times in Mark and Luke, 9 times in Matthew, and the whole rest of the New Testament, all the epistles don't ever use that title. So this was very important to Matthew. This stuck in Matthew's memory, in addition to his narration, like in verse 1. Son of David was an important title to Matthew. Why? Because it's messianic, right? Because the Messiah has to be descended from David. Only one of those 9 Matthew examples of the use of son of David is a parallel passage in Mark and Luke. And in that case, it's not the narrator's words, it's not Mark's or Peter's words, it's not Luke's words, it's the blind man who's asking to be healed, who calls out outside Jericho, Son of David, have mercy. And that's a parallel. But all of these other examples, the other 8 examples in Matthew where the Son of David title appears, have no parallel in other Gospels. So you get some of this flavor. The unique reference, these 8 unique references are often of people in the crowd using the title Son of David. Hosanna, Son of David, and so on. Why do you think that would be important? For Matthew's purposes, why would it be important for him to record the Jewish people in mass shouting, Son of David? Andy? And so when they shout Son of David, what does it say about their belief? That Jesus is the Messiah. Now think about Matthew writing his gospel in about 60, 62, whatever AD, trying to write to Jewish Christians. Why would it be important then to point out these people all shouted Son of David? It's not me, Matthew, in 60 AD suddenly deciding, hey, I think he was the Messiah, right? Which is not really convincing, right? I mean, why didn't anybody recognize him as Messiah back then, right? Well, they did. They showed it. Right? Now, in addition to the typology and the allusions, he does directly quote messianic prophecy. For example, back in the famous birth story in Matthew chapter 2, we have the story of the wise men who come to seek the king. And first, they go to Jerusalem, and they think wrongly at the time, they think they should go to the authorities first. It turns out that's dangerous. They go to King Herod and say, we hear, we have signs that a king is being born. And King Herod's reaction to that, a rival. And so King Herod says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, back in verse 1, in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived unexpectedly in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because this is what was written by the prophet. And then in verse 6 of Matthew 2, there's the direct quotation. And you, Bethlehem, and the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, because out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, interestingly, that's a quotation, but it's an altered quotation. It's an updated quotation by Matthew, because what Zechariah actually said was Bethlehem, little village, least of all the villages. But Matthew has added the words, not the least. It's like, not anymore. Not anymore is this the least among Judah. Out of you will come a people who will shepherd my people Israel. Except for him saying basically no longer the least, this is a direct quotation that he's made from Zechariah. And you see this style, sometimes when Matthew quotes, he just says, as the prophet said, and he doesn't always identify the prophet. His Jewish audience was very familiar, and they knew. Another thing Matthew does is he'll take sentences from two different prophets, or even three, and say, as the prophet Isaiah said, but only half of it's from Isaiah. Once again, his audience knew what was going on, if they were a Jewish audience. Later in chapter 2, verse 18, it talks about Herod having all of the infants in Bethlehem and surrounding land killed. Matthew quotes, then what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. Verse 18, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they were no more. Now this is a direct quotation from Jeremiah, but it's typology, because Jeremiah was not making a futuristic prophecy. Jeremiah was talking about people being carried off to Babylonian captivity. Rachel is long dead. Rachel was married to Jacob. By the time Jeremiah is speaking, she's been dead for centuries. What he's using Rachel as a symbol of the nation of Israel, as a mother of the nation, and saying she's weeping over her children, which is to say all the people who are being carried off to Babylon, some of whom are dead, some of whom are dying on the way. So she is figuratively weeping over the children of Israel, but this was not a futuristic prophecy. And this is something that Matthew does a lot of. He uses the word fulfilled. Now, when you see the word fulfilled, what do you think of? Futuristic prophecy, right? Somebody says something, and then a certain period of time later, it happens. But Matthew uses the word fulfilled in this Jewish sense of noticing the pattern that it repeats itself in the way that God deals with his people. And in that pattern, the suffering in Egypt and the suffering in Babylonian exile and the suffering under Herod, all of which are later relieved by the Lord, that's a pattern that shows the Lord is at work. The hand of God can be seen because they don't believe in coincidences when it comes to the major things that happen to the people of God. So Jeremiah wasn't making a futuristic prophecy, but Matthew says Jeremiah's words are fulfilled in what happened to Jesus, what happened around Bethlehem. Because the word fulfilled to Matthew is not limited to futuristic prophecy fulfillment. To be fulfilled is to also complete the pattern, thereby demonstrating God's work in process. And so that's something that we have to recognize when you're reading. Once again, if you don't go look up the cross-reference and go back and find what Jeremiah said in context and what Hosea said in context. When I was young and I was reading Matthew, I saw fulfilled. I assumed somebody made a futuristic prophecy, and centuries later it came true. That's true in some cases. We just saw it. Zechariah said the Messiah someday shall be born in Bethlehem. That's a futuristic prophecy. And it came true. It was fulfilled just as spoken by the prophet. But Matthew uses the word fulfilled for both futuristic prophecy and for typological pattern. If something comes true more than once, then it's really been fulfilled, basically. If the pattern happens more than once. Matthew 3, verse 3, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness. For he is the one, referring to John the Baptist, he's the one spoken of through the prophet Isaiah, who said, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his paths straight. Well, Isaiah, in context, was talking about, he was making a futuristic prophecy. But it wasn't a futuristic prophecy directly about Jesus. He was making a futuristic prophecy. Someday you're going to return from Babylonian captivity. You're going to be led across the wilderness. Is it truly a wilderness between Babylon and Israel? Well, Isaiah liked to use Exodus language to emphasize the pattern being repeated. Off to Egypt in bondage, saved out of Egypt through the wilderness back to the promised land. So when he described the coming back from Babylon, it was, you're off suffering in Babylon, you come back through the wilderness to Israel. Is it literally a wilderness? I don't know. Maybe it's nice, decent land compared to Sinai. I'm not sure, but that's not the point to Matthew. The pattern is the point. It shows God's hand at work. So Matthew uses it as, now it's fulfilled again. The Exodus, the return, and John the Baptist preparing the way through the wilderness. John the Baptist went off into the wilderness east of Jordan to teach and baptize. Right? And in that wilderness, on the east side of the Jordan, he prepared the way for Jesus Christ. So this pattern is no coincidence to the Jews. We'll pick up again there next week.